Again, and happy Sabbath. A number of years ago, when my family and I lived in Tennessee, we became really close to many of our neighbors. And there was one neighbor in particular who was a little bit gruff on the outside, but he had a heart of gold. And one day, as I was visiting with him, we got to the topic of church. And being a pastor, it's not unusual, right, for a conversation to get to talking about church. And he volunteered and he said, I don't have any use for church. All they ever do is ask for money. And then he told me a story to illustrate why he didn't go to church. He said some years before, he had been visiting his son and daughter-in-law, and they said, Dad, come with us to church. We're going to a new church. And he said, no, all they ever want is your money. They said, no, this church is different. The people are friendly. The preacher hardly ever talks about money. And it's just a place where you feel like people aren't trying to get something out of you. Come with us, Dad. Please come with us. So he did. And then he recounted for me what his experience was like going to church. When he walked in, the greeter handed him an envelope. It was an envelope for a special project they were raising money for. But hey, maybe that was unusual. At the beginning of the service, a visiting missionary told a mission story and then made an appeal for money for the mission field. And not just made an appeal, but had the deacons go through the church collecting money. Before the children's story, the kids went around collecting money. Now, we can't be too hard on the church on that one, can we be? And one kid stood right next to him, staring him in the eyes until he grudgingly took out his wallet and forked over $1. During the offering appeal, the church treasurer droned on and on and on about the great financial needs of the church. And he even used the phrase, let's all dig deep, as he closed his offering appeal. And then the preacher got up to preach, and he started his sermon by saying, if you're visiting for the first time, you probably think that all we do around here is ask for money. And then he proceeded to preach about tithe. So my neighbor told me, if that's how it is at a church that doesn't focus on money, I hate to think what it would be like at a church that does. Well, today, I'm going to preach about money. And specifically about tithe, which is God's money, and returning tithe to the Lord. And if you're visiting for the first time today, I want to assure you that I typically don't preach about money or about tithe. That here at this congregation, we don't try to fleece the saints. We believe that God brings you here to be blessed. And yes, we seek to be a blessing as well, but our focus is certainly not on money. But to try to make this transition a little easier to talking about money, I thought it might help if I actually gave some money away. So I have a great number of dimes, 10 dimes, to give to somebody. I was going to do dollars, but I'm a little cheap, so I decided dimes would be a little bit more within my budget. So is there somebody that I could give some money to this morning? Anybody like some money? Okay, back here, I saw my son raise his hand, but I'm going to forego him, Gavin, this time. So right here, okay, so I'm going to give you 10 dimes, and hold out your hand. 1, 2, I'll give you some in a second. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oops, I have 2 extra. I can give those to you, Jenny. Okay, so I gave you 10 dimes. You might want to count them just to be sure I didn't shortchange you. But doesn't it feel good for somebody to give you some money? Yeah. Now I have another question I need another volunteer. I'd like to actually get some money. So I need to ask somebody for money. Let me see here. Who could I ask? for some money. David, could I have $1?
You most certainly may.
Why, thank you. Well, you are far too generous. I was hoping for a little pushback. Now, could I have one of those dimes back? Why, thank you. That went so well. Now, it's nice to be given money. Oh, why, thank you. Wow. This may be a sign from the Lord that I need to preach about money and ask for money more often. When somebody gives you money and then asks for a little bit back, it's hard to begrudge that, isn't it? Because after all, where did the money come from that you were given? It came from that person. But if somebody just walks up to you, and you don't happen to be David, and they ask you for money, it can be a little off-putting, can't it? Because, I mean, this is my money. Why should I give you some of my money? Why don't you go get your own money? But when the money came from the person who then is asking you to give a little bit back, why, it changes the perspective, doesn't it? Absolutely. Who you view as being the one who gave you the money to begin with can shift your attitude dramatically when you think about giving back some of what has been given to you. You know, Jesus was asked about money in the book of Mark. Why don't you turn there with me? And that's exactly the point that Jesus made. It makes a difference when you think about where the money came from, or whose it is, who it belongs to. My attitude, Mark chapter 12, let's turn there together, my attitude about money, and specifically as I think about giving some of the money I have to God, my attitude, my perspective on the resources I have, if I view them as having originally come from God, it helps me be more generous as I consider how I can use what God has given me to be a blessing to others. In other words, who owns my stuff? If it all belongs to God, then that shifts my attitude. That's the point Jesus makes in Mark chapter 12. I invite you to go there with me. Mark chapter 12, and beginning in verse 13. Then they, and these are the religious leaders, sent him some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to catch him in his words. When they had come, they said to him, "Teacher, we know you are true, and you care about no one, for you do not regard the person of men, but teach the way of God in truth." Now, they're not saying that Jesus doesn't care about people. What they're saying is that he is a person of integrity. He preaches and teaches the truth regardless of who the audience is. He's not someone who just tells people what they want to hear. He tells them what is true. And so they say, "You teach the way of God. Here's a question for you. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Now, this is a loaded question. Caesar doesn't just happen to be the head of a democratically elected government. Caesar is the head of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire are the occupiers of the land in which God's people live. And so, in a sense, they're the enemy. And they're asking Jesus, is it okay for us? Is it lawful for us? Is it right for us to return or to pay taxes to Caesar, the enemy, the occupying power? Shall we pay or shall we not pay? They continue in verse 15. And I like the way that Jesus oftentimes deals with challenging questions and challenging situations. Jesus asks them a question. He says, "Why do you test me? Bring a denarius that I might see it." And so they produced a coin. And Jesus, taking the coin, says to them in verse 16, "Whose image and inscription is on it?" Now, if you have a coin, I don't have, oh, here's a coin. I did get one of my coins back. If you were to take a dime and to look at it, whose image is on the dime? Anybody remember? Good guess, not George Washington. Anybody know their money well? No. Roosevelt, that's right. Yes, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is on the dime. And there's an inscription on the dime as well. It says, Liberty, on the front here, In God We Trust, 1999. So was the year, but if you look on the back, it says United States of America. So the inscription is the country, United States of America. On a Roman coin, both the image and the inscription would have been referencing the Caesar, the person who is in charge, the ruler of the empire, and that's the response of the religious leaders. They say, Caesar's image is on it. Caesar's image is on the coin. And so Jesus then in verse 17 says, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. When Jesus is confronted with a question about money and how money should be handled, Jesus asks the question, who does it belong to? Then, he says, you should give it back to the person it belongs to, the image. In fact, if you have your sermon outline, you might want to grab that. There are a few fill-in-the-blanks. The image, excuse me, the image on the coin indicated who owned it, or at least under whose authority the coin was issued. The image on the coin indicated who it belonged to, or whose authority it was issued under. And so Jesus asks them simply, who does it belong to? And so when you and I confront the issue of money and how we use the resources that we have stewardship of, the first question we should ask is, who does it belong to? Now think about that. Think about what you have and who it belongs to. You have probably worked hard for what you have. During Sabbath school, Rodney talked about the ease of retirement and how he worked hard and then retired and just sits and sips lemonade all day long. No, that wasn't quite what you said, was it? Down by the beach. Don't want to forget the beach. Living there on the lake. No, Rodney worked hard. And he still works hard, even though he is retired. I happen to know a few retired people, and they have told me that they are very, very busy. I'm sure there probably is a retired person out there who's not busy, but it seems that retired people are very busy. But they have worked hard all their lives, and you think about what you have. You've gone to work, you've gotten a paycheck. If you're a kid, maybe you've done some chores at home, or you've mowed the neighbor's yard, and you've worked for it. It is yours. It doesn't matter whose image is on the coin. That is my money. But when we think about this from a Christian perspective, and we think about whose image is on it, who does it really belong to, as a Christian, we recognize God owns everything. God owns everything. Everything belongs to Him. In 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 11, the Bible says, Yours, O Lord, is the greatness, the power, the glory, the victory, and the majesty. For all that is in heaven and in earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord. You are exalted in the head over it. Everything belongs to God. Psalm 24, verse 1 says, The earth is the Lord's and all its fullness, the world and those who dwell therein. Not only are the possessions of this planet rightfully belonging to God, but we belong to God. You and I. Remember, whose image were we created in? We were created in God's image. Everything we have comes from God and thus is rightfully His. James chapter 1, verse 17 says that every good and perfect gift comes from above. And if you think about financial resources being good gifts, where do they come from? They come from God. As Christians, we need to recognize God's ownership and authority. Everything is rightfully His. It comes from Him and is rightfully His. But then also, we noted this just a moment ago, we are created in God's image. We belong to Him, and we live under His authority. You and I are created in God's image. Think about that. When somebody looks at us, if Jesus were to ask, whose image is in that person, would they see God? You and I belong to God. We were created in His image. And so we belong to Him, we live under His authority, and thus everything we possess is rightfully His, for we are His. You and I belong to God. We were made in His image. I like what is recorded for us in Isaiah chapter 43. Thus says the Lord, who created you, O Jacob, He who formed you, O Israel. Fear not, I have redeemed you. I have called you by your name. You are mine. You and I belong to God. We are His. And so everything that we have also belongs to God. Now, sometimes we live our lives trying to deny that reality. I'm my own man. No one controls me. Sometimes we live a life running away from God, like Jonah trying to flee from the mission God had given him to go to Nineveh. He goes down and he gets in a ship and he tries to run away from God. He wants to get as far away from God as possible because he's going to be his own prophet. He's going to be his own man. He's going to choose his own mission. We can run, and we often do, but we can't hide from God. His image is in you, even in the most sin-sick soul. You were created in God's image. You belong to God, and everything you have is rightfully His as well. So when we think about this reality, and we consider the idea of tithe and offering, if we approach the discussion from the perspective that I belong to God, everything I have belongs to God, all of the good things I have, my financial resources, even if I worked hard for them, they still are a gift from God. Then when I think about returning tithe and offering to God, I'm not giving God something. It's already His. But if I view it as it's mine, and I get to decide what to do with it, then there might be a struggle. Because I am taking something that is mine, it belongs to me, and I'm going to choose whether or not I return it to God. God invites us to recognize that He is sovereign. And everything I have is a gift from Him. But it's remarkable that God, who owns everything, and everything is rightfully His, that He gives you and me the freedom to manage, or at times mismanage, the resources that He's given to us. God trusts you, even when you're untrustworthy. God allows you to use, as you choose, the resources that are rightfully His. And so Jesus teaches us, number 3 on your sermon outline, Jesus teaches us, as we recognize that everything we have is His, Jesus teaches us to return to God, accepting His authority over all we are and all we have. He said, return to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. And if you belong to God, we should begin by giving ourselves to God. By returning to Him and accepting His forgiveness, His salvation, being welcomed into His family. That's what God longs for most of all. He wants you and me and each one of us to return to Him and experience His forgiveness, the adoption, the rebirth, actually, of being born into the family of God. That's what God's desire is for you. He's not so much interested in your money, He's interested in your heart. God longs to capture your heart. So Jesus teaches us to return to God, accepting His authority over everything we have and all that we are. And we think about, oftentimes, when we think about tithe and offering, our minds go to Malachi. We probably could quote that verse, Malachi chapter 3, where God says, "Will a man rob God, yet you've robbed me?" And you say, "In what way have we robbed you?" And he says, "In tithes and offerings. You're cursed with a curse, for you've robbed me, this whole nation." And then he says, "Bring the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. And try me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open the windows of heaven and pour out for you such a blessing, there'll not be room enough to receive it." And we think oftentimes about tithe and offering and in the context of what we get by returning to God some of what is His. Like, I might get a blessing. I might get a physical blessing, maybe a material blessing, a monetary blessing. And so maybe it would be worth it to give God a little bit of what is His, because maybe He'll give me more in return. I mean, He kind of promises that, doesn't He? This is one of the only places in the Bible where God says, "Test me, try me, prove me." But the reality is that even when we're not faithful in tithes and offerings, we oftentimes still experience material blessings. You know, it's always interesting when somebody runs for political office, like president or vice president, and they release their tax returns. Well, they don't always release their tax returns, but typically release their tax returns. And you can see how much they've given in charitable donations. We have a miserly group of people running our country. Have you noticed that? They don't tend to donate much, to give much, not at all. And some of them are tremendously wealthy. They've experienced a lot of material blessings even when they've not been faithful in following God's plan. So it's not just about material blessings. It's true, we may experience physical material blessings without returning tithe and offering to God, but we'll never experience the spiritual blessing if we don't return tithe and offering to God. And that's what God is getting. I remember the story of a big city preacher who was invited to go preach one weekend at a small little country church way out in the middle of farmland. He was a well-known preacher, very successful, had a large church in the city, and he kind of viewed it as he was just sharing some of the extraordinary wealth of his ministry by going and preaching at this little country church. And he took his boy with him, his son, and they drove way out there into the middle of God's country, the middle of nowhere, and he went into the church, and he sat up on the platform, and during the offering, when the deacon came by, he pulled out a $20 bill and he put it in the offering, and he felt very generous that he was donating $20 to this little tiny church. And when the time came, he stood up and he preached a powerful sermon. And when the service was over, the deacon came up to him, and the deacon dumped into his pocket all the money from the offering plate, which was a surprise to the preacher. And he tried to protest, but no, we were blessed, and we want to share something with you. And so as they're driving home, it's quiet in their car. The son is sitting in the back seat, and the father is reflecting over his sermon. He's thinking of the high points and his homiletic prowess and just how magnificent of a message it was. And he thinks, I wonder what stood out to my son. What did he learn from my sermon? And so he says, "Son, what did you learn today?" And the boy says, "Dad, you would have gotten more if you'd given more." And it's true. It's true. As we return to God, we do open our lives up for His blessings. It's a spiritual reality. The more willing we are to give, the more open we are to receive. And as we think about tithe and offering, God does invite us. He does encourage us. He challenges us, even commands us to return tithe and offering to Him. You know, on the back of your sermon outline, there's just a brief little outline about what the Bible teaches us about faithfully returning tithe and offering to God. Tithe is 10%. And the biblical teaching is that God invites us to return to Him, not give to Him, not pay to Him, but return to Him, because it all comes from Him, 10% of one's income or increase, and that is used to support the work of ministry. In the Old Testament, it was used to support the priesthood, who were there to minister to God's people. Today, in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, when you return tithe, it does not flow directly into Pastor Sean's bank account. Tithe, collected in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, goes to the conference. And the conference is the sisterhood of churches. Here in Michigan, it's the Seventh-day Adventist churches in Michigan. We're all banded together to help mutually care for and support each other. And so the tithe goes to the Michigan Conference. Out of every $100 of tithe that is returned here in the Otsego Church, $75.50 stays in the Michigan Conference. And it's used to pay pastors and evangelists and Bible workers and Bible teachers and the staff that are there to support and encourage and direct the work of sharing the gospel in the state of Michigan. So none of that money goes directly to your pastor. And if on a given month there is a tremendous amount of tithe that is returned, let's say that in the month of June, it's my birthday in the month of June, but let's say in the month of June that the Otsego Church is incredibly thankful for their pastor, and so tithe quadruples in the month of June. That doesn't change anything financially for me. In the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the pastor has a salary, and if the church is giving a lot of tithe, the salary doesn't go up. And if the church isn't giving very much tithe, the conference might have a conversation with the pastor, but his salary doesn't go down. It is set. It's a set salary. And so your giving through tithe does not affect my salary. Now, in some churches, it's not that way. In some churches, the more tithe the church gives, the bigger the house the pastor gets to live in. But in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, it doesn't work that way. When you return tithe, it's going to support the work of the gospel ministry across the entire state, but not just in Michigan, because you'll notice here on the back of your handout, out of every $100 of tithe that is returned through the Otsego Seventh-day Adventist Church, $8.10 goes to the Lake Union Conference. And the Lake Union Conference is an entity that helps support the ministry in Michigan and Indiana, in Illinois, and in Wisconsin. And so $8.10 goes to help support ministry across those states. But then some of that money, $15.40 of every $100 donated to tithe, returned as tithe here in this congregation, goes to the North American Division. The North American Division provides support for Adventist churches across the United States and Canada. And then $1 of every 100 goes to the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists that provides support for the world church around the whole world. So the reality is that for every dollar that you donate or return to God in tithe, it is going to support the work of the gospel ministry in Otsego, yes, indirectly, in Michigan, in our part of the country, but around the whole world. So as you're faithful in returning tithe to God, you are supporting the work of sharing the gospel around the entire world. I think God really led and blessed in the way that the Seventh-day Adventist Church handles tithe. It doesn't go directly to the pastor, and a pastor pastoring the biggest church in our conference, which is Pioneer Memorial Church, he makes the same as a pastor pastoring the smallest church in the conference. It's just the way it works in our church. So that's tithe, and God says we should return 10% of what He's blessed us with as tithe to support the work of the gospel ministry. But the Bible also invites us to return offerings to God, and offerings are free will. God doesn't tell us how much offering to return. He leaves that up to us. He says, as the Lord blesses you, then you can return offering to Him. And offering goes to bless God's church in a variety of ministries. You can return an offering, as Rob mentioned this morning, to help with the church budget, the expenses of the lights and the upkeep of the church. You can return offering that goes to pay for literature or supplies for Sabbath school, or that go to bless different ministries that we have. In the Seventh-day Adventist Church, offering is returned, as the Bible teaches, as a free will gift. It's up to you. God doesn't dictate how much should be returned. He leaves that up to you as he moves on your heart. And you can return that offering in a variety of ways to support the work of the gospel. Jesus, number 4 in your sermon outline, Jesus prioritizes matters of the heart over matters of the wallet. Jesus once in Luke chapter 11, verse 42, criticized the religious leaders of his day, specifically the Pharisees, because he said, "Woe to you, Pharisees, you tithe mint and rue and all manner of herbs, and you pass by justice and the love of God. These you ought to have done," speaking of being careful in returning tithes to God, "but you shouldn't leave the others undone." God considers tithe and offering important, but he says there's something more important, and those are the matters of the heart. God prioritizes matters of the heart over matters of the wallet. And yet the reality is that God cannot possess our hearts unless he also possesses our wallets. Because when God has your heart, he has you. And he has everything that you are. So here are 3 questions I would invite you to consider as you think about the financial resources God has blessed you with and your faithfulness in returning to him as he invites. Number 1, first question, do I accept God's authority? That's the first question. It doesn't matter about talking about tithe and offering and other commitments God calls us to if I don't accept God's authority in my life. If I don't accept his authority, that's where I need to start. And think about that. Sometimes we say we accept God's authority, but in the way we live our lives, we're not really submitting ourselves to him. So ask yourself, do I accept God's authority? And secondly, if I do accept God's authority, what does he instruct me to do? Not with my possessions, but who do they all belong to? Him. So what does God ask me to do with my possessions? And then here's a question that gets to the heart of it. Do I value him, that's Jesus, more than his money? Do I value him more than his money? We live in difficult times. Economically, it's challenging. Wages are not increasing at the rate that inflation is increasing. It costs more to drive anywhere today. It costs more to get to work and to get to church. Prices are increasing. Electric bills are increasing. Everything seems to be going up. And it can be tempting in a time like this to think, well, as I look at my family budget, maybe my commitment to God doesn't need to be first. But I want to challenge you to put God to the test and to allow God to capture your heart. And as he has your heart, you will long to order your life in whatever way he invites you to. You may be like the little boy at the counter of the general store, wanting to order an ice cream sundae, but choosing to get just a plain bowl of ice cream so he can have something left to give as a tip. I'd challenge you, if you need to make a sacrifice to put God first. He doesn't want your money. He wants your heart. Let's give him all that we are. Let's stand as we sing together our closing hymn.